also the Minister for Social Security and the Assistant Chief Minister. The panel is joined by Deputy Louise Doublé today, who's been co-opted for the purposes of this hearing. And I think it's just appropriate at this point to raise any declarations of interest that anybody wants to raise. So,
I have one, if I may. So I'm a member of the Mind the Gap campaign group, which is a campaign group with the aim is to close the gender pay gap in Jersey.
I also lodged a proposition regarding a gender pay gap consultation XP 64 2024.
Okay, that's fine. I'd like to draw everybody's attention to the following. The hearing will be filmed and streamed live, and the recording and transcript will be published afterwards on the States Assembly website. All electronic devices, including mobile phones, should be switched to silent, which is just make me want to look at my own. We don't have any members of the public with us today. It's just us. And again, for the purpose of the recording and the transcript, I'd be grateful if everyone who speaks could ensure that you state your name and role. So I'll start. I'm Deputy Helen Miles, Chair of the Corporate Services Scrutiny Panel.
Deputy Lucy Stevenson, Vice Chair of the panel.
Deputy Jonathan Renouf, member of the panel.
Deputy Louise Doublé, I've been co-opted just for this hearing today.
My name is Deputy Max Andrews.
Okay, I'm Deputy Karina Alves and I'm Assistant Chief Minister.
I'm Deputy Lindsay Feltham and I'm the Minister for Social Security.
Deputy Malcolm Ferry, Assistant Chief Minister.
Ian Cope, Chief Statistician. Nathan Fox, Associate Director of Justice Policy.
Okay, thank you very much. And just as a reminder as well, we've got 90 minutes for this hearing. So before we start, I think I just wanted to give a bit of context, really. Usually when we have our quarterly hearings with the Chief Minister, you probably get about 2 or 3 minutes on gender pay gap and the like. And we decided as a panel that we'd like to do a longer hearing because of the level of interest really that there's been in this subject. And I think it really started back in 2019 with the Is There a Gender Pay Gap report that was actually chaired by Deputy Doublé, and there was also another follow-up report in 2022. And there has been a couple of propositions, as I say, Deputy Andrews' proposition was put forward, and also Deputy Doublé put forward a proposition as well. So we thought it was actually timely to try and have a proper conversation about where the government is headed, what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, so that at the end of the hearing we've just almost got kind of like a baseline, I guess, of where we are. So again, there's a lot of us today, so we'll be chopping and changing and splitting up with questions. So first couple of questions from me. During a previous quarterly hearing with the Chief Minister, the government confirmed that it is not intending to legislate for gender pay gap reporting for the private sector, and we just wanted to know whether that was still the case.
Yeah, so that is still the case. Gender pay gap reporting is already being completed by government and state-owned enterprises. The intention not to legislate is around, I'm sure you've probably heard the reasons before, but it's about placing too much burden on businesses. It would entail quite a significant cost to government as well to administrate that, and in terms of budget, but also the resources for legislative drafting and maintaining that, and that we don't automatically think that will automatically ensure gender pay gap, gender pay equality. So instead, what government is doing is it's focusing its resourcing on policies that will tackle social inclusion and equality, and looking at a framework that can be used and endorsed by government.
Thank you. You've answered a couple of my following questions.
Sorry.
That's absolutely fine. Just a couple of them. You know, the rationale that you've given there is that the pay gap is a symptom and not the particular issue itself. But can you explain what you think the root causes are of the gender pay gaps in Jersey, and what evidence base are you using to support that?
Yeah, so obviously we've been looking at the work from the Gender Pay Gap Review panel from 2019 and the follow-up from 2022. So obviously we're aware of things like gender stereotypes, that influence subject choices, especially in sort of education, that women are often underrepresented in the higher paying roles as well. So we've seen that recently with our government CEO, is that right? Yeah,
Yeah.
Chief, who obviously was a woman, no longer is. Also, there are possibly some unconscious biases in recruitment as well. So that's something that government is looking to tackle. I'd say that as a government, we are looking at implementing policies and sort of procedures that will work towards reducing that gender pay gap. Some of those things probably come under the Social Security Minister's remit, so things like family-friendly employment law, changes to childcare.
We'll come on to that in more detail as we go through. You've said that the decision is not to legislate. Was that a unanimous decision around the Council of Ministers table?
As far as I
As
recall,
far as I remember,
it was. I think it was obviously the cost and the burden. We had some talk with Statistics Jersey, who actually went through what that would actually look like in practice. I don't know, Ian, if you want to maybe chip in there and kind of give an overview.
So, I mean, there'd been a business case a couple of years ago, which we'd been pulled together to, if government was going to go down this route,
right,
and to have like a website where businesses could drop their information in. And also we'd recognised that to start with, businesses would need support. So there was a budget factored in for instance, for us to support them initially, etc. So we were part of it was a policy for business case, but we contributed to it.
So no dissenting voices at all around.
No, and part of the CSP priorities was not to be overburdensome on businesses and allow them to grow and not be overly bureaucratic. So, but there's still lots of things that we can do and lead the way on having a positive outlook on the gender pay gap, and hopefully businesses will follow the lead from government.
Thank you.
Can I ask what the cost to government would be?
I think it was originally estimated about 500,000.
A year?
I don't know if that was initial setup. Was that initial?
So I think the original business case was something in the region of 500,000 over a 2-year period. The costs are primarily having an online reporting portal to allow businesses to get their information easily available and to match it up. There was going to be some ongoing staffing requirements to ensure that there was sort of a call, an access place in government that businesses could make inquiries and other things. There were the sort of associated IT and security costs on an on-running basis, so as a website maintenance and everything else. So the initial setup was in the region of 500,000 for the first 2 years. Because the business case ended there, what the ongoing cost would be year on year into the foreseeable future was never really calculated.
Can I ask what government would be prepared to spend in order to address gender inequality?
Well, I think at the moment we don't have anything agreed with regard to a budget specifically for that. What we do have is a 0.2 of a policy officer that's working on DEI as a whole. Obviously, that's not just gender pay gap. That also includes things like the International Cultural Centre as
Do you think
well.
that's enough? A fifth of a full-time officer?
Personally, no, I don't. But I understand that people have different views around the Council of Ministers. Ideally, I would like somebody maybe full-time to kind of bring everything together. I think that, and actually some of the discussions that we've had between us was about whether DEI should stay under the Chief Minister or whether it should move back into Social Security, because that's where a lot of the operational things are. But I think in order to keep it with the correct focus and to ensure that it's recognised as a cross-government, is issue the right word? But approach, then I think keeping it under Chief Minister is probably the best place. However, I would appreciate more resource in that area.
And what would be the increase in budget from a fifth of an officer to a full-time officer? Does anybody?
I think I'll have to hand over to Nathan. We had some chat about that.
Well, I mean, I don't have the precise calculation in front of me, but I mean, it would be if there was a decision to put a policy officer in post, it would be, I imagine, a standard policy officer cost. I don't have the...
What kind of grade would that be?
We usually run a standard policy officer grades 10 to 12 on an escalator
Does
arrangement.
anyone know what 10 to 12?
12 is what, 85? Top of 12?
Okay.
Yeah, for total cost of employment, I think that's right, including the stock sack and everything else. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So, okay, thank you. So, within the statement that was made in response to P64, there was a phrase used there that said ministers want to avoid the pitfalls of mandatory reporting. Could you clarify to the panel what you meant by that?
I think it was around so having to do some checking to ensure that businesses are actually complying with the legislation. So there was quite that would be quite a cumbersome task. There's also been some data around whether actually pay gap reporting is effective. From the economics department, I've got a bit here that says that there was researchers at the London School of Economics that found that a greater pay gap reporting led to a 1.6 reduction in pay gaps. But some similar findings have been found with respect to Denmark. However, the reduction in gender pay gaps in Denmark was through pay for men decreasing. Ian, I don't know if you want to comment on there around...
No, I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. So it was sort of around that, I suppose, whether the kind of the cost would outweigh the benefit.
So in terms of the cost and the effectiveness, I understand that research. I've seen that research as well. I was able to discuss this research with one of the former senior economists, who again, she said to me that yes, just reporting alone might not actually close the gender pay gap, and actually there should be sanctions. So some might say that just publishing the figures is actually a middle ground. Some countries are looking at having gender pay gap reporting legislation with sanctions for companies that don't comply with it. So we could actually view just the reporting as a middle ground and as an indicator of your other measures that are working. So personally, I see the gender pay gap as a key measure of gender equality. I think it's still worth doing, even if it is not solving the problem in itself. Would you consider thinking about the legislation from that point of view as a really valuable piece of data that would tell us whether all of these other things are working?
I think as far as government reach goes, I suppose, we are currently having discussions with the private businesses. And I just think that legislation, you mentioned they're like sanctions, it would be the kind of the policing of making sure that legislation is actually being followed and all of those things that make it very complicated. I think action plans are more important in addressing that. I think that if we can continue with our work with the private sector, which I think probably Nathan can expand on a little bit, with working towards producing a framework that can be endorsed by government and publicly put out there, is probably a bit more beneficial and cost effective.
Yeah, I do have some questions about that. So in terms of voluntary reporting, one of the reasons that when I've spoken to businesses, one of the reasons that some of them are in favour of a date is that some of them are already doing it on a voluntary basis. Some of them publish that. Some of them aren't publishing it, but that having an indicative date, whether it was through mandatory legislation or whether it was a voluntary date, that would mean that those companies could put it all out there at the same time, and you're less exposed doing that. So in terms of voluntary, is that something that the government is committing some resources to promoting a date where companies
that is what we're working towards with the work that officers have been doing. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I would be happy to. Would the panel like me to dwell a moment on the legislative question as well? Because that is something that we looked at.
By all means.
So the legislation in the UK provides that businesses, I think over 250 staff need to report. If you apply that to Jersey, I think we found it was very, very few businesses. So in order for it to operate in Jersey, you'd have to bring the number down. I think 50 was given as only ever indicative. Just like, wouldn't it be interesting if we tried this number, 50 people? The problem with that is, of course, you bring your work, the necessary work to comply down into businesses smaller than any other large jurisdiction would expect to comply. So you have this additional layer of difficulty for the smaller businesses. And with legislation as well, it's interesting you talk about sanction deputies. So in the UK at the moment, I think the reference is made if there's a failure to report to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission for consideration of things like a publicity order. Now in Jersey, of course, with things scaling badly as they do, if you try to recreate that structure in Jersey, you'd end up something far too big for 100,000 people with, as currently designed, one job, which would be the GPG reporting. So if you don't have that, what do? Well, the only real sanction the state has in the absence of an entity designed to manage it is to take people through the courts. So then you have a situation where you have smaller businesses in the UK being required to comply with a criminal sanction. It would fundamentally be ultimately a criminal sanction because it would be a fine. I mean, you could run it civil, but it would be a fine. And then if the fine wasn't paid, then the company would be in default and potentially the directors could be liable. So you have this this fundamental difference between the two jurisdictions that does make it considerably more complicated to legislate here. Now, that's not to say value judgment has been taken by civil service to say, oh, it's impossible to do. It's probably not. But it is different and it is more complex and it tends towards the more voluntary side from our analysis anyway.
Can I ask what your advice would be as an officer if the government were to go forward with mandatory reporting legislation? What would your advice be around sanctions or no sanctions?
Well, I mean, it entirely depends how much money is willing to be committed to resolve the issue. The gold standard would be to build something roughly equivalent to the UK, where you have a group of individuals who can manage a sort of graduated and proportionate response outside of criminal sanctions and simple fines to manage the situation. But in reality, probably if you did a cost-benefit analysis, you end up saying that's too much, so you end up with a sanctions regime, criminal, civil. I don't think we ever ground it out, really, what it would be. But it's not, I mean, anything is possible if resources are committed. And the question is, in a jurisdiction this size, what proportion of our national resources are willing to commit to any individual problem, including this? And
what would your advice as an officer be? What would you advise is a proportionate and reasonable measure in this area?
We never costed the legislation, I must admit. The business case for what it would cost to do mandatory reporting requirements was costed. The legislative development as a concept was costed. The ongoing cost of running an ECHR equivalent was never costed. So I simply don't know what it would look like to build.
Can I just test some of the assumptions you made there? You said 250 would be too high a threshold in the Jersey context, but I think actually quite a few employers would fit in that bracket. KPMG declare over 350, the big banks and financial institutions.
There would be
and
some.
so on. So would it not be a plausible starting point to start at the same threshold as the UK, and would that change the calculus?
So, Ian, we did the numbers, but I can't remember what they came out to.
I don't know the number above 250. I mean, they're the ones that are likely to be part of UK groups and already reporting in UK, and therefore would find it relatively easy to report for Jersey because they have
the numbers already.
They have the
This was going to be my follow-up.
Yeah. There's about 180 businesses that employ more than 50 people in Jersey. I don't actually know the number off the top of my head that employ more than 250. Will be small.
The point being that a lot of these companies, as you say, will already be involved in this. I mean, I've got the Lloyd's gender and ethnicity pay gap report in front of me, and it says, that they do this and are proud to do it. NatWest do something very similar. They say, holding ourselves to account by measuring our progress in gender and ethnic diversity and publishing our pay gaps is an important part of maintaining momentum towards achieving their vision. So, given that they are already doing it, starting with the companies that are probably able to do it seems to me not to put too high the regulatory burden on, but gets the ball rolling, says to people this is happening, and maybe creates some momentum for change.
It may very well. So the 50 figure simply came from doing the costings for a business case and saying, okay, what throughput volume we're going to have to manage using the system we built Is it 250? Probably not, because there aren't many. What would give us a reasonable throughput? What might it look like in Jersey for the numbers? And the answer was 50 gives you about 180, as Ian remembered. So that's the kind of throughput we'll analyse our costs on. There's never a strategic decision taken that 50 was right or wrong.
Yeah, I think the 50 was as a result of some of the conversations I had with Ian and his staff when I was drafting my proposition. But I think that's an interesting addition to the conversation. We talked about sanctions as a kind of, maybe something on the more extreme end and the middle ground. And I think, I'm not advocating for that, by the way. I'm trying to understand whether it's been discussed. Another area that I would like to understand, if has it been discussed, is action plans. So whether it is mandatory reporting or whether it's some kind of government guidance around voluntary reporting, will there be action plans as part of that?
So, as part of the talks that's been going on with Jersey Electric, PwC, Prosperity 24/7, and IOD, so they are pursuing a development of guidance which can be provided to businesses as a kind of standardised tool. We're hoping that we will be able to review that guidance, and then obviously kind of endorse it and ensure that it is published. And I think we had some talk around timeline for that. We were hoping by the end of this year that would happen. I don't know if you wanted, because I know you went to the Mind the Gap recently, so I don't know if you wanted, because officers have also been working with Mind the Gap as well.
I did attend last month's meeting of the Mind the Gap community, which was really, really good and positive. It was helpful actually because that meeting was the same week that Statistics Jersey had released the gender pay gap figures, which actually then led to a really good springboard for conversations within that community, which is not only a community of women but ally men as well, which is really, really important. Just to go over some of what was discussed before around government resources, I think we know where we want to get to and we know the outcomes, but for me it's around as well how we best utilise the resources at our disposal to make sure that we're having the most positive conversations to put us in the very best place to be acting on the action plans that the Assistant Chief Minister just spoke about, and that has to be based on positive conversations with businesses. So for me, the discussion around mandatory reporting, particularly with small businesses, every time I try and bring a progressive change to the employment law, I end up with a difficult conversation with business representatives about the effect on small businesses in particular. I think we've got an opportunity at the moment where we've got leadership from within the corporate sector wanting to work with government. We've got companies following best practice, and you've mentioned some yourselves there. And what we know is that when we're looking at recruitment and retention of employees, people are looking for their employers to have things like gender pay gap reporting, action plans in place. So I think that it's something that we very much need to do in partnership in a positive way with the private sector, but take those that are more hesitant along in the journey with us. Because my concern around legislating at the moment, specifically for smaller businesses, would be that we may then end up with negativity within the business community about gender pay gap reporting, when actually what we want is the positivity and people to see this as a good thing. So that's where I'm coming from when I talk about how we utilise our energy and our resources within this space. But it is really good to see the work that the IOD is doing. And together with the Mind the Gap community. And I've made a conscious decision not to join that community myself, because it's that community's role to lobby ministers such as myself around things that we need to be doing. And I really welcome that challenge and that discussion.
You talk there about taking people on a journey, and I appreciate that, and you don't want to just spring things on people. It takes time and you've got to work through these things together. I think it was 2019 that the Assistant Chief Minister, it was of 2 governments ago, Richard Buchanan, I think, I was sat in the room when he said, if we don't have this number, I can't remember the number, of companies voluntary reporting by this date, then we will bring in mandatory reporting. Now, COVID then happened, and when everybody regrouped after, it was, well, businesses are recovering from COVID, so let's let them recover, and then we will return to that plan. It's not a surprise to businesses. I suppose my question is, how long is that journey going to be? How long do you see it being?
I think we've got to be honest here. We've got to remind ourselves that we've got to be strict with the budget this year, and ultimately anything that involves legislation and putting new things in place is going to take its time. It's going to take money, and whether that becomes available, I guess, will dictate how long things would take. I mean, you know, I mentioned earlier that I've only got one day a week of an officer, so I think it's just, again, I suppose imposing things through legislation as well doesn't always mean that it's one size fits all as well. So I just think maybe it's something for the government to consider, maybe not, maybe at the end of this political term, but I don't think it will be something that will be pursued in this term.
If money was no object, would
If only.
would it be on the table as would it be in action now?
I think so, yeah.
I think if money was no object, we'd have a standard reporting form and everyone could feed into that, and banks and other organisations that are already doing something would just feed into a standard reporting form, and we could roll out the statistics at the end of each month or each year.
Questions?
Oh, yeah. And you did just touch on it there. So you said you've got your 0.2 of a policy officer, which equates to 1 day a week. And does that cover all of your work around diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I would argue no, but I would say that it does cover the three objectives that the Chief Minister outlined, which was obviously one of them around DEI. One of them was VORG, which has its own kind of dedicated team around that. We've got the gender pay gap, so it would cover the gender pay gap and the work that I'm doing around the International Cultural Centre as well. But obviously, you know.
So my question was, could you provide a quick update on your role in those areas, which I suppose you've talked about the 3 key areas there. If you could just kind of give us a quick update. So
I suppose VORG falls more under the Home Affairs and Justice Minister. The ICC, so the International Cultural Centre, we've currently had a bit of a rejig and a refocus, if you like, of what exactly we want to provide with that, on the back of actually the findings with the Work Permit Policy Review Panel. So we've kind of really concentrated on ensuring that we're going to provide some specialised caseworkers for our migrant communities. So that work is being progressed. I don't want to give too much away now because there will be an announcement around that, but it will be falling under ESH, which is Employment, Social Security and Housing, because that's more to kind of facilitate access to the systems and to ensuring people are getting timely information and support and advocacy, I suppose, more than anything. So that's where things lie with the DEI, with the ICC, and obviously the gender pay gap. We've got officers who are meeting with businesses to get that framework, if you like, and that guidance written. So those are.
Do you know when you expect? You say an announcement is coming on that work. Do you know when you're expecting that?
I think by about June time-ish. Yeah, I want to do it before summer. So
great. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on one point you raised there, which was you're having conversations with businesses around gender pay gap reporting. Do you have resistance?
I think I'll probably have to hand over to Nathan because he's been the officer that's been having those conversations.
Well, I mean, so my staff hat, I haven't directly, except for participating in a couple. I don't get the impression from what's fed back to me that there is significant resistance to the concept But then again, when one talks about positive concepts, there is often very little resistance. It's the nitty-gritty and the difficulties and the edges and what's in, what's out, how the structure is designed, where you start to get people saying, well, that doesn't quite work for me. And then I think that tends to be where resistance emerges, whether you're doing it voluntarily or in a legislative sense. And we haven't got to the stage of actually having a design piece to take to people and say, does this work for you yet? There are a few decisions to take around that. For instance, well, I don't know if you want me to go into the issue of the design of how you might do it now. So the UK has, I think, something in the region of 7 pieces of guidance to go to excruciating length on how exactly you do your gender pay gap reporting. And it's all fairly slick to organise when it's set up, but there are some fundamental questions that need to be answered in order to get a coherent set of figures across all industries. And they're probably not quite the same answer in every jurisdiction. So what's a full-time, what's a part-time employee? Who are you counting? You're counting temporary workers or not? 0 hours, treatment of. You have the question of bonuses, deferred bonuses, share options.
Overtime.
Precisely, the different values of overtime available. You have your snapshot reporting date, which is tax day in the UK, I think. Might not work here, not sure. So you have all these decisions that need to be taken. And it's when you start taking those and talking to businesses about it, and you know, just from other projects, when you come up with an idea and half of them like it and half of them don't, you start to get friction around people saying, well, no, do it my way because this suits me better, especially if they're reporting in the UK and they want it to be like that. But you're selling it to other businesses as, no, it's much simpler than the UK. Then you have you have 2 constituencies. You have people who want it like the UK and people who want it as simple as possible. All that's yet to be undergone. So that is where you'll start to see resistance emerging, I think. And businesses say, no, great idea, but the practicalities are the issue for us.
I'm glad you've touched on the methodologies there, and I think you mentioned overtime pay and things, because in relation to the public sector pay gap reporting, I think there's been a change in the methodology that's been used recently from looking at overall monthly earning to hourly rates of pay. Does that affect how we're able to compare the data looking?
I think, yeah, I was going to say, I know that we follow the UK guidelines on that, and we
so,
don't. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, my team aren't responsible for the Government of Jersey's gender pay gap reporting, but we have advised them.
Who is responsible then? Sorry, just for clarity.
People Services.
Thank you.
So they produce the government's gender pay gap. So we have so the change in method was based on our feedback on some earlier drafts where we pointed out that they weren't following the kind of same guidance as the UK, and now for kind of comparability purposes that's helpful. So UK guidance, you include bonuses but you don't include overtime, and you should be focusing on contracted hours. So, Government of Jersey revised I think it was their 2022 data. So the data that they're now publishing is consistent over time because they went back and revised 2022.
Okay. So we do have comparative data because that's been right. Great. Okay.
So I'll just say that the all economy gender pay gap reporting that we do actually include overtime, but because it's based on administrative data, we can't exclude it. So ideally, we'd like to exclude it, but we can't. So the way that the Government of Jersey's gender pay gap reporting is as close as we can get it to the UK. We don't have all of the data that you'd ideally like, but it's as close as we can get it.
Okay. And has any assessment been carried out about the impact of excluding that overtime, which means it may obscure what the reality of the pay gap actually is?
I think it's likely that it will because, generally men would find it easier to take on overtime, perhaps more easy than women who may have caring responsibilities or other commitments. So I think if you cut it across, then broadly speaking, more overtime would be paid to men than to women.
So there is a chance by not including it, it is obscuring an element of it.
I'm sure there is, yeah.
Thank you.
But you're kind of looking at hourly rates as opposed to total remuneration. The gender pay gap is calculated in terms of the hourly rates rather than the total remuneration. So
the hourly rate for that grade.
Okay.
So it brings me on to, if I can slightly broaden out just for a moment to get a bigger picture of the question of gender inequity more generally, and I suspect this might be for Jen, but not necessarily. But what is the best data we have at the moment about gender inequity more generally in society? What do we, what touch points do we have data-wise to know about that?
So in addition to the reporting that we do, which is the all economy gender pay gap reporting, which we've been doing for a couple of years now, there is some information in JOLS, and we could potentially ask more in that space, but there isn't really very much else in terms of gender inequality. You've obviously got the kind of FORG reporting and the recommendations in that space. But I don't think that's an issue that we've got a wealth of data on, to be honest.
I know that Gov also reports on the gender splits across all levels of the organisation as well. And I think when you mentioned Joel's, there was a mention about maybe some questions going into the census.
So in the UK census, they ask about unpaid caring, the number of people that are doing more than a certain number of hours of unpaid caring. That isn't something that we've ever included in the census in the UK, and that's, that would give you a handle. I mean, it's not necessarily just women; it can be children as well, and looking after children and elderly people as well. So that is something, when we're considering the 2031 census, if there were demand for questions in that space, it is something that could give you a handle on, are women doing more unpaid caring than men, etc.
We have health data or anything in there to tackle?
Are you talking about
Outcomes.
Are you talking about gender data across the board, not just to do with pay?
The census asks about people that have got long-term limiting illness, which we analyse by sex. I can't remember what that data shows, and we'd analyse by sex and age. And if there was different cross-tabulations that were required, we could potentially look into that.
Is there any data or any plans to collect data that would feed into the discussion around the contributing factors to the gender pay gap?
I don't think there are at the moment.
I wonder whether the discussions, you're part of the women's political group.
So we did have a discussion as part of the Women's Health Advisory Group just last week as well about the link between health inequality and also the work that we might do around women in work as well. So those discussions will be continuing. I think there's broader discussions as well. You touched on, I think, societal reasons why you might have the gender pay gap and what contributes to that, what factors contribute to that. Again, off the back of the Stats Jersey report, when I had the conversation with the Mind the Gap community, we were discussing around those factors as well. One factor for me that I always think could be tackled is one around pay transparency. So we know that women are likely to negotiate differently to men. Pay when you start a new job or get offered a job may be based on your previous salary, for example. So there's all of those things. As the minister responsible for the kind of Jobs in Jersey area of the website, I've asked my team if they can do some work on encouraging employers to be more transparent with their pay. I'm disappointed to see how much is listed as negotiable still on the website, because that is something that really I think would make a big difference. Again, there could be a legislative change there within the employment law to outlaw the people not being able to discuss pay with their employees, but that would be something that I would need to consult quite heavily with the private sector on, because that is, and again, this was part of the conversation I had about how embedded that is within the culture, within our workplaces, within Jersey. And I think that's why we saw that high gender pay gap in
the legal and finance.
Exactly, which is where that data that we've got just a few weeks ago is really interesting. And we also see those peaks when people are getting,
as well,
and bonuses and the effects that they have there. So there's a lot of cultural work that I think needs to be done, and also there's the work around parental responsibilities and caring responsibilities as well, so that it's not always the the woman that's seen as that. And we have improved parental benefits and and I'm looking forward actually to seeing my scrutiny panel's review when that comes out. And that again is why it's so important for scrutiny to work with ministers, so that you get the opportunity to really deep dive into topics that I don't necessarily get to do, and that I think that's really valuable. But going back to the public sector, I think what's fascinating for me in relation to that is we do have pay transparency in the public sector, but we still have a gender pay gap. So that suggests that there's other societal norms or issues that need to be addressed in order to address that as well.
The point is, though, that you have the data, so you can address and measure and so on. And that seems to me the basic starting point. And if you look at the housing minister, for example, he's talking about the need to have proper data on rents as being the basis for which he can make legislative changes. He's putting into the legislation that should happen, I think, in the residential tenancy law. What's different? That seems to me to be the first thing we need to do, and we're not doing it in this case.
I think that's a fair point.
With your permission, Chair, could I skip to question 31, because I think it relates.
Certainly.
And Social Security Minister talked about care burden on women and domestic responsibilities, which, of course, in the two gender pay gap reports, we pointed that out as a factor in the gender pay gap existing in Jersey. In terms of data, what data is there to help us understand what is actually happening in our homes as opposed to our workplaces in terms of gender equity and in terms of caring and domestic responsibilities?
I think we all know that there are big gaps in data, so I'm not going to pretend that there aren't. Obviously, we do have the body of work that is undertaken by Statistics Jersey, which can tell us in certain areas what issues are. We also have the opportunity from the scrutiny reports as well, and the work that you do, because I'm sure that you're getting evidence in with your review on the parental benefits and the family-friendly work that we've done. So we can always do with more data. And also, I mean, one of the factors that we've discussed before across the scrutiny table is, people being able to afford to take time off to be with their children as well, balancing that up, and also enabling them to have those career opportunities when they return to work. Obviously, we do now have a day one right to request flexible working. I was discussing only today about suitable, reasonable adjustments in terms of disability, but there's work to do about employers understanding adjustments and flexibility and what that might mean for their workplace. Again, people knowing their rights. We've had this conversation before about improving communication so that employees as well know their rights, and that's one of the requests that I've also made to our communications team, is not just to rely on JACs, which do a really good service around communicating rights, but also I think there's a role for us as government to do know your rights communication campaign as well.
And thank you. And given that we don't have that data on what is happening in the homes around gender equality, what work is government doing to actually recognise and account for the economic value of unpaid care work? What can you do without that data? Is there anything that you are doing?
So I'll pick this one up. So I think there was a scrutiny recommendation in this space about 3 years ago, which I responded to, or Dan responded to actually. So, I mean, we follow a international United Nations guidance on measurement of GDP, GVA, which excludes unpaid domestic work. Now, some countries, like the UK, produce what's called a satellite account, so you try to estimate it separately. But to do it properly, you really need to run time use surveys where you're asking people how they're actually spending their time. And it's not just women, it's men doing DIY or gardening or whatever. stereotypical things that men and women do.
Women do DIY too, just for the record.
I'm recognising that. But you need, and they're extremely complex and very expensive to run. And certainly in the Jersey context, it wouldn't be a priority, even for within Statistics Jersey. I'd much rather rerun the income and expenditure survey again. I think that's probably more urgent in a Jersey context. So I can't see us doing anything in this space anytime soon, frankly.
We do have home carers allowance though, so I think that there's some data around that can be.
And with the improvements to the social security systems as well, that should improve our access and ability to pull data through our system.
It doesn't pick up the informal carers at all.
No,
If you're,
It's the informal
if you're
ones.
employment, you
Yeah.
don't qualify for home carers allowance.
So how do you know where to target your policies and legislation without that data?
Well, that is a great question, actually, is that we're always working with the data that we have and the evidence that we get from the population that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. We can respond and make things better, as we did, as previous governments have done with family-friendly legislation. Just before I came into office, of course, that was reviewed. As you've observed, it was a light touch review at the time. Scrutiny are picking that up. So I think we've all got that role to play as assembly members in each of our roles.
It's
to
that,
identify where
it's
the
that
gaps
engagement, isn't it? And I know we regularly engage with groups like Carers Jersey as well. I don't know, Malcolm, if you want to touch on sort of the charities and just having that link.
So there is a whole group of people out there, informal carers and charitable support, which just goes unmeasured. So yeah, there is a piece of work to do there to get underneath the skin and
Can I just clarify? So when I refer to care, I'm not just talking about kind of extraordinary care and illness-related care. I'm talking about also kind of everyday parenting and perhaps elderly relative type of care.
Just to pick up on that as well, I think, Ian, you mentioned the JOLs. So in the 2024 JOLs, there was a question around like volunteering and things like that. So there is kind of informal data, if you like, or kind of, but how?
It's tricky.
So
Isn't it?
we've never asked in JOLs about unpaid care, and maybe something we could explore.
Okay,
But as you know, at the moment it's suspended next year, so we won't be coming to it for another 2 years.
I mean, it's clear, ministers, from what you're saying to us that it is a priority for you to understand what the care situation is in homes and what gender equality is like in homes. And it's also clear that the resources aren't there to do a time use survey. Do you not feel that we should be diverting the resources to do that time use survey so that we have that, so we don't have that moment of, oh, we don't have the data? Shouldn't we do that survey?
I think in an ideal world, I think the overarching kind of solution to all of this would actually to have an integrated system across government everywhere, where all the departments communicate with each other. I know that under ESH, for example, there is data on the movement of parents returning to work, for example. It captures. It's not really as accurate as it could be if we had a much more integrated system across the whole of government. Sorry, repeat.
So do you agree that we should try to find the resources to do that time use survey? I'd really like the minister to answer.
I think we need to, whatever surveys we do, we need to make sure that they are as far-reaching as possible and give us the data that we really need. I think this is where we would rely on kind of Statistics Jersey to advise us on what is the best way, the best surveys to do in order to do that and to be cost effective, because I think every department's experiencing strict budgets and things like that. In an ideal world, again, if budget wasn't an issue, I'd love that integrated system would mean that you wouldn't have, that Statistics Jersey wouldn't have to do so much work because it would all be on a system that could be easily pulled. But that doesn't exist, unfortunately.
Would you consider going away and costing it and seeing if it would be possible, perhaps not within the existing statistic JERS, it might be a resource that could be brought in, given that it has been recommended in the scrutiny review and it is something that would be a critical piece of data collection. Could you go away and think about that and perhaps get back to the panel?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that away.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just make a point? I mean, one of the Statistics Jersey's strategies, and I think you're aware, the status anyway, is to make increasing use of administrative data. We're doing that for population estimates. The gender pay gap report is based on data that's already available. And as the Assistant Minister said, the Chief Minister said, I think there's potential to link up data already held across departments much more effectively than we currently do, and that could give you quite a lot of benefits. Now, there's IT constraints at the moment that mean systems don't talk to each other very well.
Exactly, yeah.
That's not ideal, is it?
Yeah.
Just to move on slightly, but still on the theme of data, as we move on to, but the Chief Minister's comments to P13 P13 2024, I should say, explain that expanding the availability of childcare to parents would have a significant impact on pay equality. And that's something that the government's working on, I believe. How is that going to be evidenced?
Honestly, I don't know how that will be evidenced. I suppose it will be looking at the numbers of the uptake, because I think that's the other thing. We're not entirely sure on what the need is out there, and once we start providing more placements, this is something that kind of with my other hat on from an education perspective, we have had talks about that. It may be that we find that there is a bigger need for it than we initially thought. So I think it's something that's all constantly under review. I suppose it is impossible to directly measure and demonstrate. I don't know, Ian, if there was any statistics that we could.
I think when you're in this space, you're either talking about the impact of the policy and how it rolls out, and the activity. Hopefully, you might see changes in the gender pay gap over time. Of course, it's very difficult to say that policy intervention led to that impact.
As part of the kind of policy development, though, will you be putting in performance measures so that actually exactly this sort of thing can be measured as part of the development?
I think that's definitely something that needs to be looked at and needs to be considered. I think again, we won't know until things start rolling out what the need is. I know that there has been some other work around getting parents back into the workplace as well through education. So, for example, I know that SIPES have done some work around we need more teaching assistants, for example, and a lot of parents often have transferable skills but not necessarily the qualifications. So that's something that education has been looking at, encouraging people who have been parents whose children may now be in education, instead of maybe going into roles that would be lower paying and more difficult to manage with childcare.
It's interesting in the way that you're describing this, because it just keeps coming back into my head about kind of outcomes-based accountability framework. So if you're aiming as your outcome as gender pay, reducing the gender pay gap, necessarily in the policy design, you would be saying, okay, well, what do we need to know to show that we can evidence that pay gap? And again, the three questions, how much have you done? How well did you do it? Is anybody better off? And I think what we're hearing is there a coherent policy to pull everything together that's going on across departments that will contribute to that big outcome, or are we not looking at it in that way?
I can't think of anything like that that's currently
so there's nothing actually pulling it together as a whole. We've got bits and pieces going on everywhere, but the outcome to reduce the gender pay gap doesn't seem to have been prescribed as an outcome.
But I wonder if that's where, if we had the resource, if we had a dedicated policy officer who was full-time, that work would be easier to manage and easier to do.
Direct, Okay, thank
you're,
you.
You're right in terms of the focused on outcomes-based accountability, and I think as work progresses on that within government, then it will become the way we do things. Or it should
Unfortunately, it
become the way
always
we
was
do.
the way we did things, which then made it easier to articulate what we're trying to articulate in terms of difference. So that's good to hear. And I think some, the children's department do it very well already because OBA was incorporated into their plan, but everything else seems to have got a bit fragmented. Okay, that's a different issue. Sorry, Lucy, Karen.
I wonder if I could pick up on, as you mentioned, teaching assistants specifically and trying to encourage people into that area and making use of the fact we've got the Social Security Minister here, that there had been some challenges, and I think it was being encountered particularly by women with the amount of
Income
working
support,
hours and
yeah.
clashing with income support, and they were being told to go and seek jobs over the summer when they exactly wanted to be caring for
that's
their
been
children.
solved, hasn't
Has
it?
that been sorted out?
Yeah, that was all. Yeah.
Yes,
Go on,
yeah.
sorry.
It is something that I've had lots of conversations about. I was very keen to resolve that. We know that we need, again, this comes about working effectively across government, doesn't it?
Yes.
We know that we need teaching assistants and we need them to feel comfortable and valued in their roles. So, yeah.
And we also know that that's an occupation that's segregated as well. It's predominantly women.
Yeah.
So that's something that
Yes.
isn't being, that's been sorted out and it isn't being encountered as an issue for people now.
No, the last conversation I had about that was a couple of weeks ago when I followed up with my officers around that.
I understood that was resolved at the end of the previous government. That was my understanding of it. So if there are still problems, then there shouldn't be. I could be wrong though.
Maybe could we,
Yeah, I
between us, take it away and find out. The
I don't think it's appropriate to discuss any kind of particular cases.
Yeah.
There may well be people that aren't working full time as a teaching assistant, and that's where it gets
Yeah.
more complicated.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Can I move you on to the parental leave section? I'm
Can I
just
ask
conscious of time.
Just a quick follow-up on the teaching assistants, and again, different hat, but there was a planned review of teaching assistants' pay.
Yeah.
Has that been?
So it's, I think
Quickly,
it was pay and terms and conditions.
Yeah.
I know there's been a massive kind of like recruitment drive where they did some central training for teachers, for teaching assistants.
Yeah.
Which then meant that, because I think before it was schools were individually hiring teaching
Yeah.
assistants, so now we're bringing them into a kind of a central pool. They're being trained centrally, which equips them with
They had
any
pay
extras.
increases though.
I think they're still. They're still
They
on
get
the,
back to
on
us,
the,
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's still on the same.
So moving on to parental leave, how would you categorise Jersey's position on welfare policies regarding work-family reconciliation?
Do you want to answer that?
what was the last one?
Do you mean work-life balance, don't we, I think, don't we?
Balance, yeah. Work-family reconciliation and how would you, where we are now currently and our welfare policies with helping that work-life balance in families.
I think that over the past few years we've come an awful long way with the implementation of the parental benefit and the changes in legislation around rights around parental leave. Obviously we've got now two parents able to take the 6 weeks full paid leave. I think, and again, this is a conversation we've had across the scrutiny table before around the affordability of taking more leave than that. If you're reliant on the parental benefit as possibly your own sole income, obviously that is a contributory benefit. So any thought around that would need to be placed alongside all of the contributory benefits and the longevity of the Social Security Fund as well. I do think that there is, I think we're in agreement here around communication. That's where my conversation went with my communications officer the other day around wanting communication go out. I know that people get information coming to them via the midwives, and the application process for your parental benefit is started within the health service, which is, I think, a really good example of cross-government working and collaboration and systems working together. So theoretically, nobody should miss out on knowing what their rights are. But I think employers also need to have more knowledge around how they can support people as they re-enter their workplace, and also provide that flexible working. So it's great that we've got day one right to flexible working within the legislation, but I think to enable people to make the best use of that, it's around supporting people to make those decisions, know how to ask for flexible working, but also for the employers as well to know how to give that flexible working within the realms of what's possible for their business as well. So I think we've come a long way, but we're still a work in progress.
Perfect, thank you. And how has the government evaluated the effectiveness of the current parental leave policies in relation to promoting gender equality as well? Is that something that it's looked at?
So, obviously, we had the kind of the more light touch review. That review in itself didn't touch on that. We'll get the scrutiny review coming through, and I'm not sure that will.
Are you saying you'd like us to evaluate it? I'll add it to the list.
It would. I think it would be timely for us to look at how effective those measures. They were quite different measures, and actually this comes back to that cultural change within society as well, doesn't it? Around which parent or whether both parents are going to share those parental responsibilities. It's bigger than the one piece of legislation. And ripe for cross-government working as well.
So there is some data that obviously ESH holds on the movement of parents returning to work. So it captures parents who are still engaging with back-to-work services or since being classed as a job seeker from the previous September. Parents are categorised under the scheme. So they put CT4, CT5 or CT12 based on the ages of their youngest child with the income support household.
So that's around the number of hours that they're expected to
So
work
CT4
for.
would be a child turning 4, where 15 hours of work is required. CT5 would be a child turning 5, where they're expected to do 25 hours. And CT12, a child turning 12, where they're expected to do 35 hours.
Can you tell from that data, for example, how many dads versus mums are actually using parental leave?
From what I've got here, I haven't got that data.
And the parental leave data, because obviously they're booking their leave with their employer. So whilst we might know about the primary carer, because the weeks are split, we'll know for those that are claiming parental benefit. But what we don't know is how long they're then taking, perhaps in addition, because of course the right to take parental leave goes beyond the 32 weeks. It crosses over a 2-year period as well. So yeah, but again, we could probably get better data. It's one thing that I can of course follow up as well with the team working on the Transform programme around what data we can pick up as we improve our social security systems as well.
Yeah. I think anecdotally we probably all know around the table that it's a lot more women than men. What is the government doing to try to increase uptake of men in parental leave?
So I was talking about this with my officer earlier, actually, around what we do know or don't know, and actually, anecdotally, what we don't know still is whether men are still taking their 6 weeks that they're entitled to, and I think that's probably the starting point. Is actually, are people taking their 6-week entitlement, or are we in a stage culturally still where, because even though people might have an entitlement to 6 weeks paid parental leave, are they not taking it because they can
How would you find that out though?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
What we can do is look at different jurisdictions. So when we did the consultation on the employment forum for what was right for Jersey, we looked at Scandinavian countries always held up as a positive marker for parental leave. And what we found was when they made these changes, and it was decades ago, it took a number of years for that cultural shift to take place. But if you provide the mechanism, then the cultural shift will follow because people have the ability. So it's not going to happen, you know, in months or years. It's more in terms of decades where you see that shift, where men expect that as part of what they're going to do is take on those parental responsibilities and take time out of work. And they're more inclined to do that when they know it's not going to affect their career progression because there are support mechanisms in place for both men and women to make sure that they're not disadvantaged by taking that time off to undertake childcare
I
responsibilities.
think it ultimately comes back down to that kind of awareness and education piece of work on people being made aware of what benefits they are entitled to and how and when they can take them. I know we had some I had numerous constituents get in contact with me about the community cost bonus, for example, which was never, you know, because it's not tied into income support, people didn't realise that they were eligible for it.
I'm going to move on to Deputy Andrews now.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to ask, what is the government doing to support women who are currently financially dependent on the state?
Dependent on the state or dependent on
Financially.
Okay, so we've got the income support benefits.
Can you just describe what you mean
yeah.
by financially dependent on the state?
Yes, so they're not economically active, they're not working full time, and they are relying on the government to provide them with financial assistance in terms of maybe covering their
So that's
rent.
with the back to work initiatives. And
So obviously, if you are a primary carer, then you get your home responsibility protection credits for your pension.
Mm-hmm.
We've recently made a change to that, so it also covers parental benefit as well. What I was surprised to find out when I had a few cases come across my desk was that if people had a child in fairly soon after one another, we had instances where people weren't eligible for the second round of parental benefit because they didn't have contributions in the correct quarter. So I've made a recent change to rectify that, so that will enable those people that were kind of falling through that gap to get parental benefit. Where they wouldn't have previously. We obviously have income support, which is the general safety net for all islanders. As Deputy Alves mentioned earlier, the depending on the age of your child, there is a varying level of work that people are expected to look for.
Yeah.
Varying from you had you
yeah,
mentioned
sorry,
it
I
earlier.
had it
When you've got
up to
very small
4.
children, no work because your child you're undertaking care for that child, and then when they graduating, when they get to school.
Yeah.
I'm always careful when people use the term dependent on the state because I think that perpetuates the myth that there's lots of people out there on income support not working. That is not the case.
It's not the case.
So I want to make that absolutely clear. But it is important that income support is also there to support people who wish to be able to be at home with their children at a really critical stage in life for them as well. Also, I'm mindful of the work undertaken under violence against women and girls as well. So I have made sure that anybody that is in a situation where they need to leave a domestic abuse situation will automatically get 12 weeks worth of income support without having to go and produce bank statements and types of documents that would be very difficult to get in that situation. The priority has to be in that situation to ensure the safety of the parent and the children involved, and get them out of that domestic abuse situation as quickly as possible.
Just to tag onto the end of that as well. So the work permit policy as well has also recently been changed to enable those who may be in a bit of a vulnerable situation to actually be able to move jobs after 6 months, which they couldn't do before. So that's been a change as well, and they would be eligible for this support as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Minister, for taking time to respond to my question. I just wanted to know what work is being done to support those, especially single parent households who find themselves in that welfare trap, and if they do try and attempt to enter the labour market, then they'd actually be worse off.
Nobody would be worse off if they start working. That's not, if you're aware of a case where somebody's worse off, then please send it to me. But the way that income support is designed is that if you start working, you will always be better off. When you describe income support trap, can you describe what you mean by that?
So, for instance, if somebody was, say, to enter the labour market, they'd see their income be reduced, and also there'd potentially be support that would be withheld.
You wouldn't get a case where somebody on income support would see their income reduced if they started work.
I think that the formula discounts a certain proportion of their income, so it to ensure that doesn't happen, basically.
So it'd be the case of, say, if somebody entered full-time employment, and then obviously their circumstances have changed, and so before, if they were, say, a single parent, they've got a young child potentially, and they decided to take time out of the workplace to look after that child, but then if they were, say, to then return to the workplace, then, you know, what would their situation look like in terms of the government providing the support for that single parent?
So it depends on the age of the child.
If the earnings are beneath the income support components, they'll always pick up the income support, and then a portion of their earnings would always be disregarded. So they'll always be better off in that situation.
Okay.
I know Deputy Dubler just wants to skip back to the pension question.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of gaps, there are indications that there is a wealth gap at retirement age between men and women. Can you talk about any work that's been done in this area or any data that you have on this?
This is down as one of the next problems that we have, isn't it? Because we know that if you've got lower income during your working life, that is going to have a negative impact compared to other people that are earning more than you. So their piece of work on secondary pensions, which will be picked up later on during this term, I think also needs to tackle that issue as well. But still, people that can afford to save into a secondary pension will be those that are, the more you're earning, the more you can afford to save. So it is something that I think of quite a lot. It's on that list of problems, isn't it?
We had a chat, myself and Ian, about that. So it would require what's called a wealth survey.
I mean, just to address the kind of data point, I mean, we've got very little information on wealth. I mean, we run the income and expenditure service. That gives you information on income, but of course that's quite different from wealth. Other jurisdictions run periodic wealth surveys. They're incredibly complex and resource intensive to run. I mean, even asking about income is difficult enough because you'd have to get into savings and housing wealth and all that stuff. So it basically isn't something that we have. I mean, obviously there's some elements, you know, that tax will know about the interest that your earnings on savings.
That was my
Of course, that's just the interest. It doesn't actually tell you what the level of the savings is. So, I mean, bottom line is we've got very little information on wealth.
Okay, thank you. And another kind of group of islanders, I'm going to ask about two groups of islanders. So in terms of meaningful data on ethnicity and disability status of government employees, so this was something referred to in the comments to P13. Can you give an update on the collection of data in that area, please? So we're talking a lot about data.
Yeah,
it's
so the
important.
People's Services business plan for 2025 states that they would educate, support and build the capability of leaders to ensure DEI is part of our way of working. This will enable us to build a culture of trust which facilitates people to speak up and feel safe. the objective is basically to collect additional workforce data, including at the recruitment stage, to better understand the composition of our current workforce and prioritise initiatives that would enhance inclusion, belonging, recognising that inclusive services obviously stem from an inclusive workplace. There is a number of working groups, I suppose we call them, within and initiatives within government. So we've got a flexible working and parental leave advocacy group. There are workshops that are delivered on bias and allyship. There's flexible and hybrid working, women in leadership engagement events. And there's also numerous awareness sessions around and educational resources on disability, menopause, mental health, neurodiversity, sexuality and ethnicity.
And I think in a previous hearing with the Chair's panel in July last year, it was noted that discussions had begun with Statistics Jersey about the potential use of existing data and creating data sets around some of these groups. Can you update on that work?
Within the new HR systems that connect people, there's a section where you can fill in diversity information. So I've supported the HR teams to come up with questions that are consistent with the census so that you could compare Government of Jersey, the distribution in Government of Jersey against the island as a whole. So that now exists in the HR systems in a way that it didn't before. It's relatively recent, I think it was towards the end of last year. I don't know the uptake of that. I suspect at the moment it's fairly low.
So it's not compulsory.
It's not compulsory at the moment.
It's voluntary.
It's so I think there are some. I think sort of for new recruitment it is being collected, but obviously we've got people that have been in the system for a long time.
When you have that data, how will you use that to tackle any gaps, the ethnicity or disability gaps?
Well, I think that's where the kind of the working groups come in, and those initiatives around, raising awareness and having those additional resources, educational and awareness sessions.
In the UK civil service has probably been doing this for about 15 or 20 years, and my experience there was that, as I said, you can then compare the distribution by age, sex, ethnicity, disability against the population as a whole, and start asking questions about, why are certain ethnic groups underrepresented at the most senior levels, or women underrepresented. You can start to get into those kind of questions.
Can I ask the ministers, is your work informed by an understanding of intersectionality, so people that may have one or two or more of those characteristics and how they might be impacted?
Sorry, say that again.
So is your work in terms of diversity, equity and inclusion informed by an understanding of intersectionality, so where people have two or more characteristics that might be protected characteristics?
Yeah, I would say it is, yeah, definitely.
And certainly whenever we discuss the gender pay gap, I always raise the ethnicity pay gap and the disability pay gap as well. I think that when we're looking at data sets and information, we need to consider that, and we need to consider that people who have multiple protected characteristics, that they're likely to suffer even worse. I'm always conscious as well around the work that we do with our disability and inclusion team in government as well. We do have a priority as well, looking at transitions into adulthood as well. So, and again, that'll pick up around career opportunities and workplace opportunities as well.
I'm going to hand you over to Deputy Renouf now, actually. We're just coming to the end of time.
Yeah,
so
just very, having a look at the question of occupational segregation and the fact that different occupations will tend to favour different sexes at various historical reasons and so on. And I wondered what work is being undertaken, if any, to address gender pay gaps that result from this.
I think it's a massive kind of societal piece of work, isn't it? And I think we just need to be cognizant of that impact. There isn't anything as such. Obviously, within government, there are things that we're doing, but there's only so far we can reach out with that.
What sort of things are you doing in government?
So one of the positive things that we're doing is a board apprenticeship scheme, and so that is directed predominantly at women. So to get women who work for government to spend time on boards, and the whole point of that is they work for a year on a board, as you know, in their free time, or they can use a bit of their work time to do it. And it allows them to gather the skills that they need to understand how a board operates, so that when opportunities come up, so the managerial jobs come up, they've got a better understanding of how those mechanisms work and have more opportunities to go for those higher paid jobs.
There's mentoring schemes as well, and there are some sessions around confidence building and leadership running through May and December, as well as some inspirational talks. It's called the I Will Network.
We've touched on this being a result of gender norms and historical things and so on. So given that gender norms and expectations influence educational and career pathways contributing to occupational segregation, what work is being undertaken across education and industry to address these kind of influences?
I think schools are much more open to inviting people in to talk about their careers, and we're welcoming that. There are the career fairs as well, where I think all the schools across the island have the opportunity to go to that as well, and just ensuring that our sort of education, from the curriculum council, for example, anything that may need to be adapted and changed, and to ensure that we are as inclusive as possible. And you know, there's also been in the past things around STEM and the STEM subjects. I remember training in it was called CAME at the time, and CASE as well, which was the accelerated maths program and science program, to ensure that we got students involved in that. And I think role models play a big factor in this, and I think that's where we just need to ensure that schools are open to having people coming in and talking.
What consideration has been given to the labour market mobility of women relative to men? Have you done any work considering those sorts of issues?
Labour mobility. I'm sorry, can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Women getting stuck in particular jobs, men being able to move faster, that kind of thing.
I guess that kind of comes back to some of the work that the Minister was talking about, ensuring that, you know, sort of job descriptions and you know, the salary transparency. I think there was also around benefits as well. I think sometimes it's not always clear when you go for a job what benefits and whether flexi working and all of those things. So I think that probably needs to come from the kind of the jobs in Jersey section, that we start to push that with private businesses, and that but also making women aware that there is the chance that you can change. It is doable.
Thank you. I'm just very conscious of time, so I've just got a couple of final questions and then the opportunity for the panel just to ask any more. But has any consideration been given to the impact that fiscal policies have on gender income inequality at all?
Yeah, so I think from what I have understood from our economic colleagues, it's not completely clear that the pay gap would automatically grow. Narrowing the pay gap would automatically grow the economy. The reality is that this would probably act more as a kind of transfer rather than an increase in actual demand and growth. So there would be economic benefits, but the growth element, according to our economic colleagues, is overstated. So there's little evidence that the gender pay reporting has worked in other jurisdictions. As such, the economics unit has speculated whether there could be more innovative solutions that the island could take up to help narrow the gap.
Interesting perspective. It's a shame the Economist isn't here. Actually,
Yes.
we can have a very detailed conversation about that. Because
Well, maybe
actually,
you can write to us.
Yes.
Yeah.
What consequences do you think Jersey's external reputation might have if we don't do more to narrow our gap? And I asked that question specifically because of the answer you've just given previous.
Yeah, there is a reputational risk there, isn't it? You know, we need to be seen as in a place where people from around the world want to come and work and live because they know that
We're a modern
it's...
jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly.
Given the issues that have arisen during this hearing, ranging from kind of data gaps to structural barriers, etc., and I do want to thank you actually for a very open and interesting conversation across your team there. Can you outline for us what you think will happen next? What should happen next?
With regards to kind of our 3 priorities, or just in general?
In terms of a focused way of continuing to kind of reduce this gender pay gap, with or without legislation.
I think that framework, getting that framework in place and that guidance is imperative, and that if we can continue that positive relationship with private businesses to ensure that we're kind of all on the same page, and that what we've got can be endorsed by us as well, and supported by us, and then we can be much more public and forthcoming about sort of saying, kind of, we want you to publish it, and this is the guidance, and this is how the framework we'd like you to follow. I think that's...
And are there any actions that you're specifically ruling out at this stage?
I suppose that legislating is the one that's...
Okay. Does the panel have any further final questions?
I do.
Yeah, I do as well.
Do you want to go first? Good.
Okay. Just to return to the parental leave questions, just government has quite a well-established but quite generous parental leave policy that is equitable for both men and women. Is that something that is staying as it is? Has it been reviewed at all, either to look at extending it or reducing it?
It's not going to be reduced. I think it's considered to be quite a generous scheme, and that's because we do take the whole issue seriously, and we want to support parents as much as we can, because we want to make sure that people who are away for any period of time aren't disadvantaged and can still grow within the service. So it's deliberately made far more generous than most other employers in Jersey.
But there's no plans to reduce it?
Not that I know of. No.
And the parental leave weekly payment that can be claimed from Social Security, some employers choose to take that off the payment while a member of staff is still receiving payment.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that government members of staff didn't previously, it wasn't removed from their salary. Has there been a policy change there?
Yeah, so, generally speaking, it's similar to a sickness pay check where the money goes to the employer and the employer continues to pay the full salary to the employee, whereas government employees were in effect getting both. I believe that's been rectified and pared down.
You say rectified. Many private companies, particularly those linked to the UK, would have done the same, and that was a well-established government policy. Can you let us know when it changed, please?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can check that for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I've been really interested to hear about the voluntary reporting work, which reflects part of the proposition that I lodged, which, as you know, was opposed by government. But it seems that there has been a change of heart and some progress made there. Mm-hmm. One element of that proposition, which again was opposed, but I would like to ask you again now today, are you going to set a date whereby you will call on companies to voluntarily report, so that there is a voluntary date at the very least that companies are encouraged to report, and when might that date be?
I think we'd have to wait and see until we've actually got the framework and the guidance in order to be able to set a date, because we don't want to set companies up to fail as well, so we need to know how much time once we have that guidance and that framework, but
Yeah.
I'm sure we can.
Okay.
You did say that you'd have the framework by the end of the year.
That's what we're hoping for, yeah.
So is it possible that, say, for example, by International Women's Day next year, you might be
Yeah,
able to
that
say,
might be a good-
here's
yeah,
the
yeah.
guidance, please publish voluntarily.
There's a
Is that-
target date.
Is that something we can aim for
Yeah.
collectively?
I think Nathan, you said it would, the framework and the guidance would be done by the end of this year, hopefully.
Well, certainly, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
Okay.
very much our intention. What the snapshot date will be for reporting purposes might be a matter more of ruthless efficiency than picking a selected date, I think, in terms of how the businesses would like to report. But yes, certainly there will be a date. It's our fervent hope there'll be a date in 2026.
Okay, so there will be a date that there will be a clear message from government and a request to
Yes.
voluntarily report on that date. Okay, that's great. Great news, thank you.
Okay, look at that, 17
Yeah.
on the dot.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, once again, thank you very much for attending today,
Thank you.
for being very open and honest in